Hemoglobin affinity refers to the love of oxygen by hemoglobin. So high affinity means that the conditions are perfect for hemoglobin to love oxygen and load up on as much as it can get. High affinity also refers to how tightly hemoglobin will hold on to the oxygen. When hemoglobin has low affinity, it hates oxygen, hates it, will refuse to pick it up, and it will also refuse to hold on to any of it. In the lungs, during external or alveolar respiration, you want high affinity. You want hemoglobin to love oxygen, so it picks up a bunch of it from the air. In your tissues, you want hemoglobin to hate oxygen, so it drops off that oxygen for your cells. Fortunately, your lungs and your systemic tissues have incredibly different conditions, and this makes it possible that the loading and unloading of oxygen that you need to do, you're doing effectively right now. But if you go to higher altitudes, you're going to experience conditions that are horrible for the pickup and the drop off of oxygen that you need. Affinity is the love that hemoglobin has for oxygen. The percent of oxygen saturation is how much oxygen is actually bound to hemoglobin. So it doesn't matter how much it loves it, it actually matters in reality how much of it is bound. So think of this word saturation. You might spill your coffee on the carpet, and then the carpet is saturated with the liquid. So hemoglobin saturation has to do with how many hemoglobins are actually carrying oxygen. But it also has to do with how many oxygens each hemoglobin is carrying. Think of that for a minute, right? It has to do with how many hemoglobins are carrying oxygen, but we know that hemoglobins can carry four oxygen molecules. So, how many are you carrying? All right, let's start with the simplest idea. The x-axis of this graph is partial pressure of oxygen, which is kind of like oxygen concentration. So really what this graph is saying, it's what its first sentence is. As oxygen concentration increases, or as the amount of oxygen in the environment increases, or as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, hemoglobin's love for oxygen increases too. And hemoglobin saturation of oxygen increases. That makes total sense. If there's more oxygen around, hemoglobin's going to try to pick up all that it can and hold on to all of that it picked up. Hemoglobin is hungry for oxygen in the presence of oxygen when there's a lot of it. Hemoglobin will grab all that it can, like a pack animal at feeding time. But when oxygen is in a lesser concentration, as in the air really high up in the mountains, oxygen affinity is low. It doesn't want to pick up more oxygen. And whatever it has, it holds on to it. That's not good. The Bohr effect sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple when you think about it. When you are making ATP, you also make carbon dioxide. It's a waste product. Carbon dioxide can become a bicarbonate anion and a hydrogen cation when it hits the water of interstitial fluids or plasma. That little hydrogen cation, it lowers pH and it makes everything more acidic. This is that acidity that you always fight every day, right, to keep in homeostasis. So that hydrogen cation, it basically goes up to a hemoglobin and it pushes it into releasing some of the oxygen it's carrying, right? It's like prodding it. It's like release, let it go. Break up with that. Break up. These little hydrogen cations that are constantly being made by the carbon dioxide from your mitochondria, they are causing hemoglobin to drop off the oxygen that your tissues need. So in your tissues, hemoglobin has a low affinity for oxygen. It hates it, right? And that's mainly due to the low pH that's created. And this is perfect, right? Because I want my hemoglobins to drop off oxygen in my tissues. This is called the Bohr effect. And basically, it just says oxygen is unloaded where it's needed. So, this, more than anything else, applies to exercise. During exercise, you create a lot of carbon dioxide as a waste product of making ATP, right? You create more of it than you usually do. Your tissues, they get really acidic really quickly. But this is great. It's actually great, right? Because you need more oxygen than normal to your tissues since you're exercising. The colors on the background of this graph, they reflect the Bohr effect. On the left side of the graph in yellow, exercising tissues need oxygen, and hemoglobin has a low affinity for it. Good. Then it'll drop off all the oxygen that it has. Perfect. Over on the right side of the graph, here in the lungs, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is huge. Perfect. Great. Perfect. I want my hemoglobins to pick up oxygen in the lungs. And now this is why I'm fascinated at people who have attempts to climb Mount Everest because there is less oxygen per volume of air. Every breath you take at a high altitude contains less oxygen than the air that you breathe at a lower elevation. Your lungs are not operating over here on the right side of the graph in blue. They're actually operating over here on the left side of the graph in yellow, and it puts your lungs in a place where hemoglobin has a low affinity for oxygen. That's bad. That's bad. That means that the oxygen in your lungs, the hemoglobin in your lungs, isn't going to pick up the oxygen. You want hemoglobin to love oxygen in your lungs. But if you go to higher altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen lowers, and so does hemoglobin's affinity. All right, so one ding. Altitude alone makes it worse to breathe. Number two, it's cold. Hemoglobin loves oxygen when it's cold. Loves it, right? And that's great because hemoglobin, it also means it holds on to oxygen really tightly when it's cold. That's not good. In fact, when it's cold, this entire graph shifts to the left, right? So we're not traveling up or down the line. We're actually shifting the whole line to make this blue line here. And your systemic tissues are probably not really 98.6 Fahrenheit anymore. That's not good. You want your hemoglobin to be able to drop off oxygen into your tissues, but it won't because you are colder than normal. That's not good. Number three, you are shivering all the time because it's cold. This causes you to generate ATP and carbon dioxide at a faster rate than normal. This decreases your pH. This shifts the entire curve to the right, or the green line on the graph. This affects external respiration. Now your hemoglobins have a reduced affinity for oxygen, and they refuse to pick it up in the lungs. They like to drop it off in the tissues under these conditions, but that doesn't make any difference because your hemoglobin still are refusing to pick up the oxygens in external respiration. So what is the lesson here? Humans start dying at high altitudes. There are people named Sherpas that can be guides in Mount Everest, but most Sherpas are tasked with simply carrying gear up Mount Everest. That sounds simple, but it's not. The increased altitude places a significant demand on the body, and carrying 40 pounds of extra stuff is way harder than you think, and that's a lowball estimate. Sherpas can carry hundreds of pounds, well, probably around 100. I used to use the article for another class of mine, and the article that I had, it was about how Sherpas might be adapted to life in higher altitudes. It proposed first that Sherpas, and this was based on measurement evidence, Sherpas seem to have thoracic cages that are larger than the thoracic cages of the general population. So Sherpas are capable of achieving a higher volume and a lower pressure in inhalation. They can decrease their intrapulmonary pressure more than you or I could increase it. And this increases the value of the gradient on the top of the equation of airflow. If the numerator increases, so does airflow. And this is similar to the case study patient with asthma. Our patient has complained of neck and side pain. Most likely, our patient is using their accessory muscles unconsciously to increase the volume of their thoracic cavity. This would allow them to overcome the resistance in the denominator of the fraction for airflow. In both situations, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, and that increases airflow. The article also suggested a blood difference for Sherpas. This was not verified with evidence, just a hypothesis. It was proposed that Sherpas may have more hemoglobin per erythrocyte or more erythrocytes in their whole blood. Either quality would increase the oxygen carrying capacity of their blood. And this is the principle on which training for athletic exercises, training at high altitudes, or using a low pressure mask or chamber when working out can increase your ability to carry oxygen. If you are consistent in working out at lower atmospheric pressures, you will start making EPO. And that will naturally increase your red blood cell count or your hematocrit over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. For climbers on Mount Everest, yes, many of them these days now train in low pressure masks or chambers. But even if you do, when you get to Mount Everest, you spend a few weeks in Nepal just letting your body adjust. And then you go up to base camp and you spend a few weeks there, again, letting your body adjust. And then you do a few partial climbs before finally making your final trek to the summit. And all of these steps here, these allow people to increase their EPO production. What the article found was that Sherpas who came back to Nepal decreased their crit. And then Sherpas who were also taken to lower altitudes also decreased their crit. So it's not something that they just naturally have, like an increased ability to carry oxygen. But they do have the increased ability to take in oxygen at higher altitudes.